It was getting close to 2 a.m. when my old Ford completely died on the side of Route 12, deep in the woods of Maine. The radio had been blasting this irritating static before going completely dead. The darkness out there was pitch black and suffocating. The massive pine trees completely blocked out any moonlight. I was on my way back from a late shift at a nearby canning factory, and my cell phone had absolutely no service. I got out of the car, went over to the trunk to grab a small flashlight, and decided to walk, hoping to find a house or a nearby town. After about half an hour of walking through the freezing cold with the wind howling through the trees, I spotted a faint yellow light flickering through the branches. I cut off the main road and walked down a narrow dirt path covered in dry leaves until I reached an old, dilapidated farmhouse. It was built from dark wood that looked like it was slowly rotting away. I knocked on the heavy wooden door a few times. After a long, agonizing minute of silence, the door opened, very slowly, and without a single creak. Standing there was an incredibly thin woman, wearing an old house dress with a faded plaid pattern. Her face was as pale as ash, and her eyes were deeply sunken, surrounded by heavy, dark circles. I asked her if I could use her landline. She just stared at me with this completely blank, expressionless look. Then she took a step back and pointed her thin hand, with unnaturally long fingers, toward the inside of the house. She didn't say a word. I stepped into the hallway, and the smell inside was suffocating. It was this bizarre, nauseating mix of mothballs, vinegar, and dried blood. The woman led me very slowly through a dark hallway until we reached a small living room with furniture from the 1960s. There was an old black rotary phone sitting on a wooden table in the corner. I walked over and picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. Instead, I heard this strange, wet sound. It sounded like someone swallowing hard, breathing slowly, like their mouth was full of some thick liquid. I quickly turned around to tell the woman the phone wasn't working, but my heart completely stopped. The woman was standing right behind me, just inches away from my face. I hadn't heard a single footstep. Her wide eyes were staring dead into mine without blinking. Then, I watched her lower jaw slowly drop, sagging down way deeper than any normal human jaw should. A sharp, chilling hiss came out of her throat as she whispered, "They are finally asleep. Don't wake them." At that exact moment, I heard the heavy click of the front door locking from the outside. I jumped backward, smashing into the wooden table. The black receiver slipped from my hand, dangling in the air while still making that wet, sickening sound. I pointed my small flashlight toward the hallway and watched a massive figure emerge from the darkness. It wasn't a normal man. He was easily over 7 feet tall, wearing tattered clothes covered in dark, sticky stains. His entire head was covered by a rough burlap sack, with 2 uneven slits cut out for eyes. Through those slits, 2 bloodshot human eyes stared at me with pure animalistic madness. In his right hand, he was holding a massive rusty meat hook, the kind they use in slaughterhouses. He was dragging his left foot behind him, making a harsh, scraping sound against the hardwood floor. Driven by pure survival instinct, I lunged toward the only window in the room. I tried to force it open with shaking hands, but it was nailed shut with thick screws from the outside. I spun around. The thin woman had completely vanished from the room, but the massive guy with the sack was advancing toward me. Slowly, confidently, making a clicking sound with his teeth from behind the burlap. In a moment of pure desperation, I ducked past him, taking advantage of his slow movement, and bolted down the hallway toward the kitchen at the back of the house. The kitchen was as dark as a grave, and the stench of rotting meat was so intense I almost threw up. I quickly swept my flashlight around, looking for a back door, and the beam hit a large wooden cutting table in the center of the room. I froze in my tracks, letting out a muffled scream. Lying on his back on top of that table was a little boy. He couldn't have been older than 7, wearing pajamas. His eyes and his mouth had been completely sewn shut with thick, coarse black thread. But the absolute worst part was that his tiny chest was slowly rising and falling. He was still alive, struggling to breathe through his nose. Before I could even process this nightmare, I felt a sudden freezing chill against the back of my neck. I looked up. The thin woman was dangling from the dark kitchen ceiling like a spider, gripping the wooden rafters. Her upside-down face was smiling at me, a smile so wide it tore the skin of her cheeks, letting dark, black blood ooze out. And right then, the heavy thud of the giant's meat hook slammed violently into the kitchen wall. Right behind me, I grabbed a wooden chair and shattered the small kitchen window with everything I had. I threw myself out through the broken glass, the sharp shards slicing into my face and arms. I hit the muddy ground outside in the pouring rain and just started running. I ran like a lunatic through the thick woods, never looking back. I could hear the branches snapping and that sharp, terrifying hiss from the woman moving at a horrifying speed through the treetops right above my head, while the heavy thuds of the meat hook kept slamming into the tree trunks right behind me. I ran for what felt like an eternity, until I tripped and fell hard onto the asphalt edge of the main road. Just then, a massive semi-truck came speeding down the road. I stood up in the middle of the lane, waving my arms frantically. The driver slammed on the brakes, bringing the massive truck to a halt just inches away from me. I scrambled up into the passenger seat and told him to move. "Go, please, just drive. There are people killing people in the woods." The driver, a large man wearing a baseball cap, just stared at me with a completely numb, frozen expression. He didn't say a word. He just slowly pressed the gas pedal. I tried to catch my breath, checking my bleeding cuts, and turned to look out the side window back at the dark woods. At that exact moment, I noticed something that made my heart completely stop. The smell inside the truck cabin started to change. Very quickly, it became the exact same stench of mothballs, vinegar, and dried blood from that farmhouse. I turned my head very slowly toward the driver, feeling a level of dread I have never felt in my entire life. The driver wasn't looking at the road. He was slowly turning his head toward me, and I realized he was wearing a flannel shirt, with the exact same faded plaid pattern as the thin woman's dress. As he raised his hand to adjust his cap, I saw his fingers. They were unnaturally long and covered in fresh mud. I whipped around to look at the small sleeper berth in the back of the cabin. There, under the dim glow of the dashboard, I could clearly see the blood-stained burlap sack sitting on the bed, and right next to it was a massive spool of thick black thread and a long, heavy sewing needle. The driver turned completely toward me now. His eyes and his mouth began to stretch open as he whispered in that exact same wet, sickening voice from the phone. "We told you not to wake them, and now it's your turn to sleep." The truck suddenly swerved off the main highway, launching right back into the deep, dark woods, while from the roof of the truck, I started to hear the sound of sharp fingernails scratching violently against the metal, and the muffled sound of a little boy. I was traveling alone from New York to North Carolina to attend my grandfather's funeral. It was right around 11 p.m. when I pulled my car off Interstate 95 in Virginia. The rain was coming down so hard that the windshield wipers couldn't even keep up. My GPS had completely stopped working, because of the terrible signal in this dark, rural area. The dim glow from the dashboard was the only thing lighting up my face, and that low fuel light just kept staring at me with its annoying orange color. I had no choice but to look for a gas station or a small motel to spend the night. After a few minutes of driving blindly through the thick pine trees, a fading neon sign caught my eye. It was flickering in a green light. Pine Valley Motel, vacancy. I immediately turned down the narrow, muddy driveway. The motel was incredibly old, built in that 1970s cabin-style layout. There was only one light working, inside the front office. I parked the car and ran through the pouring rain. When I pushed the office door open, a tiny brass bell chimed overhead. The smell inside was strange, a mix of dampness, mold, and some cheap chemical cleaner trying to mask the scent of something else. Behind the worn-out wooden counter sat an old man with incredibly thick glasses, making his eyes look huge and completely unnatural. He was wearing a dirty flannel shirt, and he didn't even look up from his old magazine until a few long seconds had passed. I asked him for a room for the night. He looked at me, very slowly, then gave me a hollow smile, showing yellow, decaying teeth. He didn't speak. He just reached down, grabbed a heavy metal key with the number 14 on it, and placed it on the counter. He wanted $20 in cash, so I paid him. He pointed his hand toward the dark path outside and said in a dry, raspy voice, "Last cabin on the left. Don't open the door for anyone after midnight." I figured it was just a stupid joke from an old guy living in isolation. So I took the key and walked out. I drove the car down to cabin number 14. It was completely isolated from the rest, surrounded by trees on 3 sides. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The room was freezing. It had a double bed, an old TV with a massive screen, and a single window facing the dark woods in the back. I tried to turn on the heater, but the unit just let out a loud rattling sound and blew out cold, dusty air. I decided to just lay down with my clothes on under the heavy blankets, hoping to fall asleep quickly. It was getting close to midnight when I started hearing strange noises. It wasn't the rain. It was the sound of footsteps, very light and very slow, walking around the cabin. The footsteps were sinking into the mud, moving with a steady rhythm. I felt tense, but I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, like a raccoon or a deer. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, right at the back wall of the cabin, directly behind the headboard of my bed. I held my breath. Then, I heard a faint scratching sound on the wood outside. It sounded like someone was dragging their fingernails, very slowly, across the wall. I got up as quietly as I could and moved toward the window. I looked through the rain-streaked glass. I couldn't see anything, just total darkness, and trees moving with the wind. I let out a sigh and turned around to go back to bed. Right at that exact moment, the old phone on the nightstand let out a loud, piercing ring. The sound was so sharp it made my heart jump. I stared at the phone in shock. Motels like this rarely have working lines. I walked over and picked up the receiver with a hesitant hand. No one spoke. All I could hear was heavy, rapid breathing and the faint sound of rain in the background. I said, "Hello, who is this?" There was no answer. The breathing just got heavier. Then, I heard a very familiar sound coming through the receiver. It was the sharp chime of that tiny brass bell from the front office, followed by the old man's voice, screaming in pure terror. "It's not me. He is inside with you." and before I could even process the sentence, the power cut out completely. I sat there on the edge of the bed, completely paralyzed by fear. The darkness was so thick I couldn't even see my own hand. The moldy smell in the room suddenly grew intense, changing into the stench of rotting meat. I could hear it clearly, the wooden bathroom door, moving millimeter by millimeter. My breath was shallow, and I fought to stay absolutely silent. I remembered my cell phone was in my coat pocket, hanging near the front door. I started to move, very slowly, crawling on my knees across the bed, and then onto the cold hardwood floor. Every single floorboard I pressed on made a tiny creak, cutting through the dead silence. I reached the coat and successfully pulled out the phone. I lit up the screen, keeping the brightness at the lowest setting so I wouldn't give away my position. I quickly pointed the phone's flashlight toward the bathroom door. The door was wide open. The bathroom was empty, but the floor was covered in fresh, wet mud and a trail of large, bare footprints heading directly toward the small closet in the corner of the room. My hand began to shake violently. I swept the light over to the closet. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal with everything I had. The tires spun wildly in the mud for a few terrifying seconds before gaining traction, and the car launched forward, swerving right past the old man's body. The thing on the roof rolled backward from the sudden jolt, but I could hear its claws scratching deeply into the metal roof, making a sickening, scraping sound. I drove like a lunatic down that narrow, pitch-black driveway until I finally burst onto the empty rural road. I was doing over 80 miles an hour through the fog and rain, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching for any movement. After about 10 agonizing minutes of driving, the lights of Interstate 95 finally appeared in the distance. I felt a massive wave of relief when I saw a large, fully lit Love's truck stop ahead, surrounded by big semi-trucks. I swung into the parking lot and slammed to a halt right in front of the main store. I got out, gasping for air, and ran inside. The young guy behind the counter looked at me with horror because of my appearance. I was drenched in mud, pale as a ghost, and shaking uncontrollably. I told him to call the police immediately, that there was a murder at the motel down the road. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. I sat in the back of a cruiser, still trembling, and told the investigator every single detail: the footsteps, the phone call, the eye in the closet, the old man's body, and the thing that jumped onto my car. The investigator listened with a grim, skeptical look on his face. They dispatched 2 units to the motel to check it out. I stayed at the gas station for over 2 hours, watched over by another officer. Right around dawn, the investigator came back, with a deeply disturbed, confused look on his face. He sat down across from me and said in a low voice, "We went out to the location you described, son. The Pine Valley Motel has been completely abandoned and boarded up since 1994, after a fire destroyed the main office and killed the old owner inside." My head started spinning, and I yelled at him, "That's impossible. He gave me the key. His body is out there in the mud. Go look for the body." The investigator just looked at me coldly. "We searched the whole place. There are no bodies. The cabins are completely overgrown with weeds and decaying. But there was one thing we found that we can't explain," I asked in a trembling voice. "What?" He pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was the heavy metal key with the number 14. "We found this key lying in the thick dust inside the last cabin, covered in your fresh fingerprints. But that's not all." The investigator walked me to the back of my car and shone his flashlight on the roof and trunk. On the metal of the roof, there were deep, long gouges from 5 human-like fingers with sharp claws, carved deep into the paint, and right in the middle of the back window, there was a perfect, clear imprint of a human face, smudged against the glass, along with a thick, dark residue that the heavy rain hadn't completely washed away. It's been 3 years since that night. I left Virginia and never went back, and I sold that car the very next day. The police eventually closed the case, writing it off as some local vagrants messing around. They never believed my story about the motel. But the horror never really stopped for me. To this day, whenever it rains at night and I'm lying in bed in my new apartment in Chicago, my cell phone will start vibrating from an unknown number. And when I finally pick it up, driven by pure anxiety, I don't hear a voice, just heavy, rapid breathing, and the faint chime of a tiny brass bell ringing somewhere in the background, followed by a slow, faint scratch. I was 19 years old when I decided to spend my summer vacation in Ohio. I rented a small, cheap basement apartment in an old house owned by an elderly couple in the suburbs of Toledo. The house was surrounded by a neglected yard, and the apartment had a separate, completely isolated side entrance. During the first week, everything was pretty normal, and honestly, a bit boring. I spent most of my time reading and browsing the internet, but things started to change at the beginning of the second week, specifically during the afternoons. In this area, the afternoons are dead silent because everyone stays indoors due to the heavy humidity. I started noticing a strange sound coming from the corner of the room, right behind the heavy wooden wardrobe that was fixed against the wall. It was a faint, steady scratching sound, like something alive was moving very slowly behind the drywall. At first, I just thought it was mice, which is pretty common in old houses around there. But the sound was too heavy, and it never happened at night. It always started exactly at 1 p.m., lasted for a full hour, and then stopped out of nowhere. One day, wanting to get rid of the mice, I decided to push the heavy wardrobe aside to see what was behind it. When I finally moved it with great effort, a strange chill ran down my spine. The wooden wall behind the wardrobe had a small, neatly cut square, covered by a piece of cardboard attached with old duct tape. I peeled off the cardboard very slowly. I expected to find a utility space filled with pipes or wires, but what was disgusting was the smell that immediately burst out. It was the scent of very old dust mixed with something that smelled like burnt sulfur. I pointed my phone's flashlight into the gap. There were no pipes. It was a narrow, dark tunnel extending horizontally beneath the foundation of the house. I carefully put my head inside the opening and shone the light to the very end of the passage. A few meters away, I saw something that made my breath completely catch. There was a small child's sneaker, blue and heavily faded, covered in a thick layer of dust. Right next to it was a long strand of blonde hair lying on the ground, and old postage stamps from the 1980s scattered all around it. And at that exact moment, the power cut out completely in the apartment. The room went pitch black, and I heard it clearly, coming from the depths of the dark tunnel right in front of my face. The sound of a deep, wet breath being drawn in, followed by a warm child's voice, whispering in pure terror. "Please, put the cover back." I scrambled backward, violently, smashing my back against the wardrobe. I was hyperventilating in pure panic, surrounded by total darkness. I grabbed the piece of cardboard and frantically taped it back with shaking hands, then pushed the heavy wardrobe with all my strength to block the opening again. I immediately went upstairs using the outdoor steps to speak with the owner of the house, Old Man Arthur. I knocked on the door loudly until he opened it. He was wearing his gardening overalls and looked tired. When I told him that I heard strange noises and found a hidden opening behind the wardrobe, the look on his face changed completely. The kind expression vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, dead stare. He said in a sharp, dry tone, "That opening is just for maintaining the old heating pipes. Do not mess with it again, or I will have to terminate your lease immediately." He didn't give me a chance to argue, and slammed the door right in my face. I went back down to my apartment, completely shaken up. I couldn't sleep at all that night. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint vibration in the apartment. The refrigerator in the small kitchen was making a strange noise, like it was shifting from its spot. I got up and turned on the living room light with trembling hands. When I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. The fridge wasn't moving on its own. There was a small gap in the hardwood floor right beneath it, and there were human fingers, incredibly pale, long and thin with no fingernails, reaching up through the crack, slowly trying to pull the fridge's power cord downward, to unplug it. I let out a terrified scream. In a split second, the fingers retreated back into the crack with a strange speed, and a heavy silence followed. I approached very slowly and looked through the small gap using my phone's flashlight. I didn't see a face. Instead, I saw a massive pile of papers and old photographs scattered down there. They were pictures of missing children, including a little boy wearing blue sneakers. Suddenly, a very wide eye appeared in the crack, staring right up at me from below. It blinked slowly. Then, I heard a sharp scratching sound of fingernails against the wooden floorboards right beneath my feet, and the noises started moving fast under the floor, heading straight toward my bedroom. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw my essential belongings into a small backpack and decided to leave the place immediately. When I stepped out of the side door into the yard, it was almost 4 a.m., and a thick fog was suffocating the Toledo suburbs. I walked fast toward the nearby bus stop, about a quarter of a mile away. The streets were completely empty of cars. I got on the very first bus that arrived, went straight to the airport, and booked the first flight back to my hometown. A few days after I got back, I couldn't get what happened out of my head. My conscience was eating me alive because of those pictures of the children. I decided to call the Lucas County Sheriff's Office in Ohio and filed a detailed report about what I saw in that basement apartment and the photos of the missing kids under the floorboards. The police took the report seriously and sent a unit to search the house. 2 days later, the detective in charge called me back. His voice was filled with absolute shock and disturbance. He said, "We raided the house, son. Old man Arthur and his wife were found dead in their bed. They've been dead for at least 2 weeks from gas poisoning, which means they were rotting corpses the entire time you were staying there." My mind went completely blank. I asked him in a panicked voice, "Then who was the man I talked to? And what did you find in the basement?" The detective let out a heavy sigh and said in a terrified tone, "When we moved the wardrobe and went down into that narrow passage, we didn't just find pipes. We found a massive network of narrow, dark, wood-lined tunnels extending under the entire neighborhood. We found belongings of missing children dating back to the 80s. But the worst part, we found extremely tight spaces in the tunnels right under the floorboards of the neighbors' bedrooms, perfectly designed for someone to lay flat on their back and listen to everything happening above them. We found old, dried bloodstains on the wood. And even worse, we uncovered secret passages leading directly inside the walls of the houses themselves. 10 years have passed since that night. The tunnels were completely filled with concrete, And they never caught the person, or the thing, that was living down there, moving inside the walls while people slept. I tried to forget everything and live a normal life in my new high-rise apartment in Boston. But about a week ago, the humidity in my bedroom started rising for no reason, and dark spots began appearing on the plaster ceiling. Yesterday, at exactly 1 p.m. while I was reading in the quiet living room, I heard it clearly. A faint, steady, dragging sound, like something heavy was sliding very slowly inside my bedroom wall, followed by a tiny whisper coming from right behind the power outlet next to my bed. The sound of a wet, hissing breath saying, "We missed you."